listen, you can't be in a position where you're like, I want $2 million, you, I don't care what you make.
The next day I got a phone call from Dana White.
Oh, really?
Dana White never calls me when I was in UFC. He called me, goes, you dumbass, you just ruined this whole thing we're trying to set up for you, blah, blah, blah. And I was like,
Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson is the greatest flyweight ever and one of the best fighters in UFC history. He holds the record for the most consecutive title defenses in UFC history with 11 wins. Despite all his achievements, Johnson ended his UFC career on bad terms with UFC boss Dana White. Their relationship became so bitter that Johnson left the UFC while still dominating. The reason Dana White hated him will really shock you. Demetrious Johnson first got into martial arts at 13 when his high school coach suggested he try out for the wrestling team. As soon as he stepped on the mat, he knew it was for him. This started a journey that led him to a career in mixed martial arts. He began his MMA career as an amateur in 2006, winning his professional debut with a first-round knockout, and then winning his next 8 fights, including 5 in a row by submission. This success earned him a deal with World Extreme Cage Fighting (WEC) in the bantamweight division. In his first fight in the WEC, Johnson lost by unanimous decision, but bounced back to win his next 2 fights. Then, the WEC merged with the UFC, and all WEC fighters, including Johnson, moved to the UFC. Competing in the bantamweight division, Johnson started strong, winning his first 2 UFC bouts, but then losing to Dominic Cruz by unanimous decision. When the UFC and WEC merged in 2011, the UFC's lighter weight divisions grew significantly. At the time, the lightest weight class in the UFC was the bantamweight at 135 pounds, which left out fighters under that weight. To give these lighter fighters a platform, the UFC introduced the flyweight division at 125 pounds for more balanced and exciting matchups. On March 2nd, 2012, the UFC debuted the 125-pound division with 2 semi-final matches in Sydney, Australia. Joseph Benavidez defeated Yasuhiro Urushitani by second-round TKO in the first match, while Demetrious Johnson fought to a majority draw with Ian McCall. Johnson later defeated McCall in a rematch 3 months later, setting up the inaugural flyweight title fight against Joseph Benavidez, who many considered the best 125-pound fighter in the world. In the first ever UFC flyweight title fight, at UFC 152 in September 2012, the match between Demetrious Johnson and Joseph Benavidez was all about speed and technique. Johnson clearly took the first and 5th rounds, while Benavidez claimed the 2nd and 4th. The 3rd round was incredibly close and could have gone either way. Ultimately, Johnson did just enough to secure a close split decision win over Benavidez, becoming the first UFC flyweight champion. Even though Johnson was a champion after UFC 152, there were still questions about him. In early 2013, his split decision win over Benavidez as an underdog was unexpected, so facing John Dodson in his first title defense was a critical test. Dodson, a TUF 14 winner with powerful hands, had knocked out fighters like TJ Dillashaw and Josier Formiga. In their fight, Johnson's worst fear nearly manifested as Dodson forced him to fight through more adversity than he'd ever experienced before. In the opening few rounds, Dodson knocked Johnson down in the 2nd round. But in the 4th round, Johnson turned it around, landing heavy punches and knees, ultimately winning the fight and securing his first title defense, putting the UFC world on notice. By this time, Johnson had certainly captured Dana White's attention. But Johnson didn't stop there. He continued to rack up victories, including a knockout win over Benavidez and a unanimous decision win over Ali Bagotinov. Johnson's dominance was clear when he defeated Bagotinov at UFC 174. His technical mastery, speed, and unique striking style made him nearly untouchable in the 125-pound division. His seamless transitions between striking and grappling made him a formidable opponent for anyone. His victory over Bagotinov marked his 4th straight title defense, since winning the belt in September 2012. With DJ becoming champion and racking up wins, he should have enjoyed certain privileges. But that's where the problems began. Even though Mighty Mouse was miles ahead of everyone else in the flyweight division, he didn't get the perks that champions in other weight classes enjoyed. For one, he was often featured on the UFC's free televised events on Fox, rather than the more lucrative pay-per-view events. It seemed like he was tasked with leading a weight class that struggled to catch the mainstream fans' attention. This led to multiple disputes with the UFC and Dana White over his contract. Johnson accused the UFC of undervaluing him before and after he became champion. He even broke down his earnings during a live stream, revealing that when he fought Dominic Cruz for the bantamweight title in 2011, he earned $14,000 for the show and $14,000 for the win. Although he got a better contract after becoming the flyweight champion, he still didn't receive pay-per-view points. Johnson claimed that the UFC told him, "We do not give pay-per-view points to flyweight guys." That said, the relationship between Johnson and Dana White took a significant hit with the Ultimate Fighter Tournament of Champions. The UFC planned to bring in 16 flyweight champions from around the world to compete for a shot at Johnson's title. But the problem was that Johnson first heard about this from a random fan in his Twitch chat during a stream. Unaware of the plan, he thought it was a stupid idea and said so on stream. "Well, that's effing stupid," he said. The next day, Johnson got a call from Dana White, who yelled at him and called him a dumbass for ruining their plans. Johnson explained he had no prior knowledge of the plan, and his reaction was based on hearing about it for the first time from a fan. Even to this day, Johnson maintains he does not regret what he said before Dana lashed out at him. But that incident marked the beginning of the sour relationship between Dana and DJ. The incident didn't stop Johnson, though. He continued to dominate the 125 division, successfully defending his title against that season's winner, Tim Elliott. DJ then defended his belt again a few months later with a win over Wilson Reese, tying Anderson Silva's UFC record with 10 consecutive title defenses. But that's when his relationship with the UFC really took a turn. For his record-setting 11th title defense, Johnson was expected to face number 3 ranked flyweight contender Ray Borg. However, the UFC wanted him to fight bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw, who would be making his flyweight debut. The UFC was desperate to finalize this fight, but Johnson had several concerns. The biggest issue was that Dillashaw, a former 135-pound champion, had never competed at flyweight, so there was no guarantee he would make the weight. If Dillashaw couldn't make weight, it would eliminate Johnson's chance to break the title defense record. Additionally, Johnson had already agreed to fight Borg, which the UFC had demanded. Nonetheless, Johnson was open to fighting Dillashaw as long as the UFC paid him $1 million and provided monetary guarantees if Dillashaw missed weight. Negotiations were difficult, and Dana White often criticized his champion publicly. On the UFC Unfiltered podcast, White called it insanity for Johnson to turn down the Dillashaw fight and insisted that Johnson was expected to accept it. This public call-out didn't sit well with Johnson. He responded with a 1,900-word public statement, blasting the UFC for trying to bully him into taking the fight and for their continued mistreatment throughout his reign as champion. In his statement, Johnson wrote, "Unfortunately, UFC's mistreatment and bullying have finally forced me to speak out. I've decided to speak out now as I feel like my values and character as a person and a fighter are being tarnished by an organization I've done nothing but sweat and bleed for over the last 7 years of my life." Johnson also claimed that the UFC threatened to eliminate the entire flyweight division if he didn't accept the fight with Dillashaw. He stated, "They went on further to say that if I didn't take the fight against TJ and drop Borg as the opponent, they would get rid of the entire flyweight division." Johnson expressed his frustration over the lack of support from the UFC over the years. He said, "The UFC has failed to market and promote me appropriately. Prior to my last fight, where I tied the record for the most consecutive successful title defenses, we waited to repost UFC's social media posts about me from the Facebook page. There weren't any posts until a few days into fight week. Then there were a total of 2 posts, in comparison to others who they promote across their social media platforms. They failed to do their job in promoting me and that monumental event. Ultimately, the fight against Dillashaw that the UFC desperately wanted never materialized because the UFC wouldn't agree to Johnson's terms. Johnson's bold move to publicly release his statement and the tense negotiations further strained his already fragile relationship with Dana White. Nevertheless, DJ continued to excel, fighting Ray Borg and delivering one of the most spectacular finishes in UFC history. This win not only secured him the victory, but also showcased an incredibly advanced technique, setting the record for the most consecutive title defenses. However, DJ's UFC career didn't last long after this milestone. He lost his flyweight belt to Olympic gold medalist Henry Cejudo in his next fight. Soon after, Johnson was traded to ONE Championship for Ben Askren in a mutually agreed decision, marking the end of his UFC career. After years of dominating the flyweight division, the UFC considered shutting down the flyweight division, but ultimately kept it. The division has since seen a remarkable resurgence, with fans finally appreciating the skill, dynamism, and excitement of the 125-pound fighters. As for Johnson, while many already regarded him as the greatest of all time, his achievements in ONE Championship have only reinforced that belief. He quickly defeated 3 top contenders to win the ONE Flyweight World Grand Prix Championship, experienced a setback against Adriano Moraes, but then reclaimed the title from Moraes and won the trilogy fight. Despite being underappreciated during his UFC days, Johnson remains a legendary figure in the UFC and MMA, continuing to prove his greatness wherever he goes. Let me know what you think about the controversy in the comments section down below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and smash that subscribe button for more content like this.